Tonight, President Biden backs Israel's account of the Gaza hospital explosion on a day of angry protests across the Middle East. This is a Sky News special programme live from Jerusalem. Standing with Israel, President Biden says America's current assessment suggests that Israel is not responsible.
We're going to stand with you. We'll walk beside you in those dark days. We'll walk beside you in the good days to come.
We'll be taking a forensic look at the evidence available as intelligence agencies try to determine what happened. Also tonight, how the so-called Day of Rage called for by Israel's enemies erupted across the Middle East. In the West Bank, our chief correspondent witnesses youngsters being shot by Israeli snipers. I'll speak live to an IDF spokesperson and ask if the force is necessary. And one niece killed, another missing, and their mother among the dead. I speak to an uncle whose relatives fell victim to Hamas.
I don't know how to plan one funeral. I cannot think about doing 2, 3, or 4.
Hello and good evening from Jerusalem. The US President Joe Biden today backed Israel's claim that a deadly explosion at a hospital in Gaza was the result of a failed rocket launch by Palestinian militants. That is, despite counterclaims from Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group inside Gaza, who say that an Israeli airstrike was responsible. Well, President Biden's remarks came on a day when protests erupted across the Middle East, including in Lebanon, in Jordan and Iran. During the programme, we'll bring you a report from our international correspondent Alex Rossi in Beirut, our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey in Ramallah on the West Bank. But first, our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle has this report from Tel Aviv.
President Biden arrived in Israel with the war at a dangerous inflection point. As he was taking off from Washington on Tuesday night, news was breaking of hundreds killed when a missile hit a hospital in Gaza City. The Israelis said it was a rocket that was fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad and malfunctioned. The US agreed. Biden was met off Air Force One by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The two have had their differences recently, but America's support for Israel following the Hamas attacks has been unwavering. Behind closed doors at the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, the two leaders met along with Israel's war cabinet. Biden was briefed on Israel's actions so far and how they hope to achieve their objective, wiping out Hamas.
This will be a different kind of war because Hamas is a different kind of enemy. While Israel seeks to minimize civilian casualties, Hamas seeks to maximize civilian casualties. But united in purpose and with a deep sense of justice and the unbreakable spirit of our soldiers and our people, Israel will prevail.
After the politics, Biden met with victims of the attacks, family members of some of those taken hostage, and some of the people who were first on the scene that Saturday morning 12 days ago.
I treated wounded people, soldiers, civilians, but mostly the children, as I am a pediatrician. So babies burned in their mother's arms, some with stories that I don't think they'll ever recover from.
Addressing the media before taking off back to Washington, Biden had a message for Israel.
The terrorists will not win. Freedom will win. We're going to stand with you. We'll walk beside you in those dark days. And we'll walk beside you in the good days to come. And they will come.
He repeated his warning to Iran and then delivered some hope.
Today I asked the Israeli cabinet, who I met with for some time this morning, to agree to the delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, based on the understanding that there will be inspections and that the aid should go to civilians, not to Hamas. Israel agreed the humanitarian assistance can begin to move from Egypt to Gaza.
Whilst Biden was speaking in Tel Aviv, Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip continued, out of sight and earshot, but barely 40 miles away. This was a message
of solidarity to Israel and the Israeli people. It was a message of condolence and support to the victims and their families. It was a message of caution to Israel's military and political leaders in the battle ahead.
President Biden left Israel after just 7 hours on the ground. It was a short visit after a long flight, but if his trip here has prevented this war from spreading and made progress on other fronts, then it will have been worth it. If not, then the world might be left wondering that if the US president can't, then who can? Alistair Bunkle, Sky News in Tel Aviv.
Well, Gaza's Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, claims 471 Palestinians were killed in the hospital explosion. The incident happened amid a growing humanitarian crisis. Tonight, there was news of some help on the way. That's because Israel says it won't block aid entering Gaza from Egypt. It comes after the World Food Programme warned the population of more than 2 million people was at risk of starvation. Diana Magnay has our next report, which does contain images that some viewers may find distressing.
The clear-up has been fast. The body parts, moved from where so many injured and displaced had gathered at the Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City, and where hundreds had met their deaths, the final toll still not clear. Here it is now a question of picking through scattered possessions, collecting tiny shoes, the debris of shattered lives. This man lost his brother and his cousin in the blast. His uncle now is in intensive care. This is where he was sitting when it happened.
People were flying, whole bodies, body parts. There was a guy on fire just here. I was not as upset for my family as I was for that man who was burning in front of me. People were trying to put the flames out. Where are the freedom-loving people? Where are they?
This was meant to be protected ground, a hospital, a safe haven. These images now of the hospital car park, one piece of evidence in competing claims over who was responsible. Israel, as Hamas says, or militants from Islamic Jihad based in Gaza, as Israel says. And on the ground, the despair of a people who feel that no one is on their side.
I say to all the Arab officials who did not stand with the people of Gaza who are under siege for many years, they did not do anything for us. They are looking at us like insects. We became like beggars. We're going from house to house. Why are you not standing with the people of Gaza?
Israel's airstrikes have continued all along the Strip. Here at the Bureij refugee camp, with, for Israel, some success. Hamas confirming that one of their top military commanders, Ayman Nofal, who was responsible for coordinating activity with Gaza's other militant groups, was killed in this hit. Other strikes with apparently less strategic gain. This bakery nearby also targeted and 4 of its workers killed. And the food that is so hard to come by in Gaza now, literally burning. In the south of the Strip, the Rafah crossing stays closed, despite the US president's declaration that humanitarian supplies would start coming through. Another day of waiting, too, for those desperate to leave.
Unfortunately, all Gaza is under attack. All Gaza is a place or a ground for complete bombing. So I ask the people out there, the people who have a heart, who do care, to find us a safe haven, or at least get us out of Gaza.
At least there are some still smiling. This little boy and his sister, crouched in the rubble in the southern city of Khan Yunis, delighted and a little shy at the attention of our team. A touch of innocence amongst all this misery. But mostly it is just misery. An accumulation of bloodied body bags and the wrenching pain of those not quite ready to say goodbye. Diana Magnay, Sky News.
Well, Hamas was quick to blame Israel in the aftermath of last night's explosion. But this morning, Israel's defence forces produced what it said was evidence that they were not responsible. Our data and forensics correspondent Tom Cheshire has been taking a closer look.
This is an explosion that, first of all, has claimed lives. There's also inflamed opinion across the Middle East and the world. The Sky News data and forensics team has been examining the open source visual evidence, video and satellite. This is what we know, and just as importantly, what we don't know. Now, this is where the Al-Ali hospital is located, in Gaza City, in the area that Israel had warned Palestinians to evacuate from. And nearby is where we believe one of the first videos was taken. It appears to show the moment of impact. The plume of smoke you see from the explosion in this video is consistent with other videos that have been published. But there are other sources of video. The Qatar-backed TV channel Al Jazeera was broadcasting live from this location here. And as you can see from the map, it overlooks the hospital pretty directly. It's just less than a mile away. Now, in their footage, we see what looks like a missile rising into the sky, then malfunctioning. You're about to see an explosion here. Now, this is taking place at around 7 p.m. That is important. And shortly after that, we see this explosion on the ground. Now, we're confident that this shows the actual missile strike. These distinctive buildings you can see in that video, take note of them, because they appear to match up to these ones on the Google Earth imagery covered in solar panels at the front of the hospital. So we're confident where it is. But there is more video. This is filmed from inside Israel, first published by an Israeli television channel. It's a lot further away. Their point over here is around 12 miles from the hospital, but it does correspond. Note the timestamp. Again, it's around 7 p.m, corresponds with that Al Jazeera video when the timings for night fell and the reports of an explosion at the hospital came through. And projectiles are seen being fired into the sky to the west of the hospital in the moments before the explosion on the ground. And there's another video that's filmed from the north. We've put this in yellow so you can see that barrage. That's the same place. And then in the red over here, we're going to see the same explosion. We've put those together for comparison. Now, this is what the car park looks like in the morning. Burnt out cars, but beyond that, the damage is relatively minimal. And here's a view of the crater it left. Again, that is small, especially compared to the aftermath of previous Israeli strikes we've seen this week, which have leveled buildings and even neighborhoods. Now, none of that is definitive evidence. It doesn't rule out an Israeli airstrike at the same time as the apparent rocket failure, perhaps with a smaller missile, nor does it say it came from Hamas or Islamic Jihad. But it is the best picture we have so far.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus from Israel's Defence Forces. A very good evening to you, and thank you for joining us so late in the day. We've seen your evidence then on that hospital explosion in Gaza. Do you accept, though, that those people would not have been sheltering in the vicinity of a hospital like this if you hadn't bombed them out of their homes?
I think your question is very unfair, and we could go back and ask, had they not been there if Hamas hadn't launched a murderous attack on our civilians and butchered 1,000 civilians and raped women and mutilated bodies of Israeli civilians and taken almost 200 hostage? Where should we start?
Well, let's delve into your claims that you do everything possible to avoid civilian casualties, because looking at the face of it, some might say it's not a very successful policy. Just had the very latest figures from the Health Ministry in Gaza. You'll say, of course, it's run by Hamas. They've put out these figures tonight. At least 3,478 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli air raids on Gaza. Another 12,000 Palestinians have been injured. 70% of the victims, they say, being women, children and the elderly. At least 13 others also remain missing, including 600 children missing under the rubble. I'm sure you dispute those figures. Do you have a better idea, your own idea, of what's been known as the collateral damage of civilians after your airstrikes?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. First, I would like to say that we categorically do not strike civilians. We don't aim to strike civilians. That is not the purpose of our military operations. If it were, the situation would be much, much worse, and it isn't, because we do not purposely strike the civilians. We have done a lot, not everything, but we have done a lot in order to get civilians out of the way. We have called on them 5 days ago to evacuate northern Gaza, and who has been holding that up? Who has been preventing it? Hamas. The numbers are questionable at best. At this time, I do not have other numbers because we are not on the ground and we don't have access to the people who make the list or define who is a combatant and who isn't a combatant, I can only say that I think everybody in the world should treat any piece of information coming out of Gaza with extreme, not just a little bit, with extreme scrutiny and caution, much more than what you and others treat the information that we provide. And by the way, in the very interesting analysis done by your colleague of the explosion, none of our evidence was displayed. And I think that is very odd because we provided evidence like no other organization did. Definitely Hamas didn't provide any evidence. We provided aerial footage. We provided radar imagery of where the rockets were fired from. We provided a voice recording of two Hamas operatives discussing the matter and confiding between themselves that, oh yeah, this appears to have been a malfunction. Why isn't that displayed? And why does the claims made by Hamas, why are they given such prominence, and why are our claims undermined and Sky hasn't been able to independently verify?
Well, in fact, you demanded we independently verify last night, and that's what we attempted to do today. And I think you'll find
you don't
we
display
took a
our
news
evidence
conference this morning, your IDF briefing in full, and have discussed it every hour on Sky News. You say specifically that you don't hit hospitals, even though the World Health Organization yesterday, ahead of this explosion at this hospital, said that 150 medical establishments had been damaged. Do you, therefore, mark clearly on the maps that are being used by your pilots in those airstrikes, no strike, no fly zones, so you specifically know where these medical facilities are?
Yes, not only medical facilities, but mosques, schools, other hospitals and sensitive areas, they are not targeted unless, and there are times that this happens in the necessity of war, unless the enemy uses them for military activity, and then they become a legitimate military target. But even then, even when Hamas does that, and he does it, they do it continuously. Nothing is holy for Hamas. But even when Hamas does that, we go to extra lengths in order to make a decision if the military value of striking such a target is proportionate to the fact that it would be a strike of a humanitarian facility. We don't do that lightly, and it is extremely rare. Many of those incidents that in the report that you refer to, I would argue that they are indirect attacks or indirect strikes or damage that was caused by attacks nearby, and these facilities were unfortunately affected. And again, I think we should be judged by our capabilities to inflict damage and the damage that is done on the ground. Had we been trying to strike civilians and to do actual damage to all of those, all of that infrastructure that mustn't be struck, then of course the situation on the ground would be far, far worse. We are not. We go to lengthy processes of intelligence analysis and approving a target before we strike it.
OK, apologies, I was trying to interrupt you there because we haven't got very long left. We filmed in Ramallah on the West Bank today. Can we just play you this just for one moment?
Small groups of youngsters are taunting the Israeli Defense Forces stationed at the main military communications hub. Above them, snipers wait and watch. And every now and again, they fire. Bullets, not tear gas. Ambulance teams rush forward to pick up the latest to be shot. They're treated as quickly as possible at the scene before speeding off.
So 4 young men shot while our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey was there. He wasn't there very long for throwing stones, live rounds for throwing stones. Is that a proportionate response, or is it actually an inappropriate response given how inflamed tensions already are?
Yes. Listen, the situation changed significantly on October 7th. For many years, Israel has been very restrained in its use of force and very restrained in what Palestinians could do in terms of weapons close to Israeli communities. We are aware of intentions in Judea and Samaria of Palestinians there to try to copy or emulate the same type of attacks that Hamas did, the same type of murder and butchery and rape and mutilation that Hamas did in the communities around the Gaza Strip. There are aspirations and intentions by Hamas and other terrorist organizations in Judea and Samaria to do the same. So we are on high alert. There is no room for nonsense. There is no room for taunting Israeli troops, as your reporter calls it, even though a stone can kill. And if somebody gets hit with a stone in the head, that's a lethal blow. So I don't think it's any game at play. And the level of tolerance for Palestinian violence and approaching Israeli communities is significantly lower. And I think it is about time that Palestinian leaders control where their young are. And if they want to be out of harm's way, they should stand clear of Israeli communities and clear of Israeli troops.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, IDF spokesperson, much appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, ma'am.
Well, let's get some reaction to that interview then. I'm joined by our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, who is in the Jordanian capital, Amman, for us this evening, where people have certainly been demonstrating in support of Hamas again, Dominic. Tensions are high. Stay away. We do protect civilians. The words there from the Lieutenant Colonel.
Yeah, and I think for people here and from the side of the argument we've been hearing all day on the streets in Amman and also on Arab streets across the Arab world, the arguments, the debate about what happened at that hospital and what else is happening in Gaza sound rather academic. And if that sounds unfair on the Israelis, obviously it's very important that accuracy is sought after and the truth is found, particularly in terms of attributing blame for horrendous events like the attack on the hospital. But the facts of life are pretty brutal for the Israelis here, which is that on the street here, people have made up their minds already, and they have decided that the Israelis are responsible for that attack, but also responsible for the deaths of many young children whose bodies have been lined up outside hospitals in Gaza and have been shown on Arab news channels. Pictures that have really inflamed passions across the region. And also, I think, for the Israelis, the problem is that whatever the rights and wrongs of the debate they're debating on Western channels, so that they hope will be heard by Western leaders and encourage them to continue supporting Israel, those leaders are also affected by what is happening on the Arab streets, by the threat of regional instability. And they also know, those leaders, that the longer the kind of ferment continues on the streets in Arab cities like Amman, and I think it will get a lot worse potentially on Friday, after Friday prayers, the more that goes on, the more the chances of other enemies, like Hezbollah in particular, getting drawn into this, whether their Iranian patrons want them to or not. And that is a deep worry for Western leaders as they look with increasing concern of what's happening in Gaza, whatever their sympathies for the Israelis are. And I think all of that means that, rightly or wrongly for the Israelis, they may talk about a long war in Gaza. They may talk about the need to take as long as it takes to eradicate Hamas, but they are still going to be affected by the fact that the longer it goes on, the more the chance of things happening like the hospital attack, whether they did it or not. Tragedies like that will continue to inflame passions, and that will mean that the kind of support for Israel in the West is not indefinite, and therefore their campaign in Gaza will have to be defined in a more limited way. They'll have to say exactly what their aims are and say how long it's going to go on for, which I think means the Israelis are, in some respects, restricted in a military sense about what they can do there. However much they state their aims to be more infinite in terms of trying to destroy Hamas.
Yes, and we can hear the noise behind you, Dominic. Just bring us up to date.
Yeah, I'll get out of the way and I'll show you what's going on here. This has been a process that's been going on all day in Amman, and it's now fairly empty down there. You can see the water cannon truck flanked by 2 armoured vehicles. You can see high-vis jackets that the Jordanian police are wearing. In the last 5 minutes, just before we went on air, they fired, I think, a baton round or possibly tear gas, and that caused a kind of stampede up that road you can see in front of us. You can see, I think, the crowds milling at the end there. To the right of the picture, there is a large crowd still behind the trees. What they're trying to do, these protesters, and they've been shouting all day that their support for Hamas, support for the Gazans, is express their outrage about what's happening in Gaza, but also to try and get up the street that's ahead of me here. Now, up there is the Israeli embassy. Last night, they got close enough to the embassy to light fires. They tried to storm the building. They were stopped by the Jordanian police, who are this evening here in much greater numbers. And there's been this sort of standoff all day that it seems the Jordanian security forces are for now winning. But as I say, there's a huge amount of strength of feeling on the streets here. The Jordanians are very angry by what's happening in Gaza. They're determined to make their feelings known. They say they want to get to the embassy again, and this is going to go on for a few days, and as I said earlier, could culminate on Friday after Friday prayers.
Dominic Waghorn, live for us there in the Jordanian capital. Thank you. Well, you're watching a special programme on the Israel-Hamas war, still to come. We will have more on that day of rage across the Arab world, including bloody clashes in Beirut outside the American embassy there. President Biden today and more Western leaders on their way, but will Israel listen to their appeals to find a diplomatic solution to the conflict? And I speak to the uncle of a British girl who's still missing, while her mother and sister are among the victims of Hamas. This is a very strange atmosphere, this subject of such horrific attack.
On both sides, one has to say that this is just the most awful situation.
We could hear the distant sound of gunfire.
It's a complete stalemate.
This is a war, and it's going to go on for a very long time.
The most important thing is that you do talk to them, because if you leave it up to what they're seeing on social media, they're being exposed to misinformation and disinformation, and we know that there's a lot of new accounts being set up which are designed to kind of spread the misinformation, to confuse people, whether you're a government or an aid agency or a news organisation, to try and understand what's going on is difficult, let alone a child. So it's really important that even if your child hasn't mentioned it to you, you don't know what they've seen or what they've heard or what they're making of it. So it's really important that you actually just check in with them and say, you know, have you heard about this? What are you thinking?
What's your advice to parents on tackling something they perhaps themselves don't understand?
I think to direct them to a trusted source of information. Now, of course, on Sky News, we have our very own FYI, which goes out every weekend, and on Sky News and on Sky Kids. And at First News, we come out every Friday. You know, we curate the content, especially for children. We are avoiding too much distressing detail or imagery. And we've got this week a big 2-page feature explaining the background, which actually is a good thing for adults to read too.
All right.
Just to put it all into context and to make sure that they really do have an understanding of what's going on.
What's terrifying is the random, sporadic nature of these attacks.
One has to say that this is just the most awful situation.
And as the government has said, this is a war, and it's going to go on for a very long time. The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
Well, as we saw from Amman, there have been demonstrations across the Middle East today following the deadly explosion at a hospital in Gaza. Protests erupted after a call from the Iran-backed Hezbollah militant group for a day of rage. Its intervention has raised concerns that Israel's neighbours could be dragged into this conflict. And meanwhile, the Foreign Office has tonight advised against all travel to Lebanon. Well, in Lebanon, violence erupted outside the US Embassy and the French Embassy in Beirut. In Jordan's capital, Amman, protesters attempted to storm the Israeli embassy there. And rallies also occurred in Iran's capital, Tehran, where protesters were filmed chanting "Death to America." In multiple cities across Egypt, including in the capital Cairo and in the Tunisian capital of Tunis, while multiple protests broke out on the West Bank, the largest in Ramallah, with clashes between demonstrators and security forces, also occurring in Nablus, Tubas and Jenin. Our international correspondent Alex Rossi is in Beirut and sent this report.
As the US president visited Israel, the American embassy in Beirut was the focus of a day of rage. Volleys of tear gas were fired into crowds to stop them storming the building. The Lebanese militant group Hezbollah had called for a show of unprecedented anger after the hospital blast in Gaza.
We are demonstrating here in support of the people in Gaza because of the massacres carried out by the Zionist enemies. Of course, the demonstrations may escalate due to the Israeli slaughter.
The Palestinian cause is a righteous cause, which everyone must embrace. We should stand against ethnic cleansing and racism.
On the streets across the Arab and Islamic world, there's disbelief at Israel's explanation. No one here accepts the carnage at the hospital was anything other than an IDF airstrike.
There is widespread anger across the region. Protesters have gathered outside the US Embassy. They're throwing stones, they're trying to break through the gates. Now, they are angry not only with Israel, but also the United States, who they claim is complicit in war crimes being committed in Gaza.
And the longer the bombing of Gaza goes on, the greater the chance of this furious reaction escalating into something much worse. In the Jordanian capital, Amman, people turned out in their thousands to support the Palestinian cause and vent their anger at Israel and America. The protests in Egypt were just as vocal, as people marched, calling on the world to open its eyes to what they claim is Israeli terrorism. The US president is hoping to contain this conflict from spreading, but America here is not seen as an honest broker. Instead, its unwavering solidarity with Israel could make this crisis much worse. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Beirut.
Well, let's just take you to pictures then from Istanbul in Turkey. It appears there are more protests outside the Israeli consulate there. People once again raising Palestinian flags in support for the Gazans. The very latest pictures, as you can see, from Turkey. In the West Bank as well, there were violent clashes between protesters and police. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, spent the day in Ramallah and sent us this report.
Live fire, ambulances, smoke and stone-throwing youngsters. The West Bank is seething after the Gaza hospital disaster. There's 3 days of mourning and a general strike here after a terrible week and a half in this troubled region. Small groups of youngsters are taunting the Israeli Defense Forces stationed at the main military communications hub. Above them, snipers wait and watch. And every now and again, they fire. Bullets, not tear gas. Ambulance teams rush forward to pick up the latest to be shot. They're treated as quickly as possible at the scene before speeding off. There's nothing unusual about these pictures on the West Bank, but 4 youngsters were shot for throwing stones right in front of us, and we didn't stay for a very long time. It says so much about life here and how violence dominates everything.
Over 60 people have been killed in clashes in the last week or so on the West Bank. It's not much reported, but it is a fact, and that's something that really explains how this has changed. 60 is hardly mentioned. That's because so many are dying in Gaza and, of course, in that attack by Hamas.
The centre of Ramallah was brought to a standstill by relatively modest crowds demonstrating against events in Gaza. The West Bank has been quite quiet since the Hamas attack in southern Israel, and Hamas wanted people on the streets. The crowd paused for prayers for the people of Gaza, led by Hassan Youssef. He's a senior Hamas leader. Be under no doubt Israel wants him. His presence will be noted. The people who gathered here have varying and differing views on the future for Palestinians. For now, they're united in condemnation of Israel.
Every 1 minute, every people dying. That's enough.
From both sides?
Yeah, both sides. American, Arabic, Gaza, Jewish, it's enough. The same. Kill here and kill here. It's enough.
Do you think it will be enough? Will peace?
Maybe, inshallah. I wish to stop the war.
I think it's our time in the West Bank to actually stand against this apartheid, to do something about it. What's happening today is part of a struggle that has been going on for 75 years, like we said before, and this should be a continuous movement. I think this is up to the people of Palestine to solve. I don't think we should look for international solutions, because that is, like, this has not worked in the past. So it's up to us Palestinians to stand up and be like, this is not right.
The international community's diplomats are working round the clock to try to stop this volatile situation from exploding into a regional war. On the streets, they're waiting to see what happens. They aren't happy. Few, if any, in the Middle East are happy right now. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, in Ramallah, on the West Bank.
Well, you are watching a special programme on the war between Israel and Hamas. Coming up, we'll reflect more on Joe Biden's visit here and his empathy both for Israel and the victims of the Hamas attack. just bring you some breaking news we're getting from the US President Joe Biden, who has said that Egypt's president has agreed to open the Gaza border crossing to allow 20 trucks through with humanitarian aid. We'll bring you Mr. Biden's remarks in a moment. He's been speaking on his way back from Israel on Air Force One and at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, it appears. We'll certainly bring you that when we get it. But let's talk more about the significance of that visit with Brett Bruin, a former White House director of global engagement. Great to have you on. My first question was going to be, was it right for him to go, and what did he bring? If indeed he manages to get these trucks across the southern border, then that would be a result, wouldn't it?
It would. And look, we heard earlier in the day that Biden had gotten Netanyahu to agree to open access for humanitarian assistance, which I think in and of itself was a strong indication. As you're now saying, we have the Egyptians coming on board, albeit 20 trucks isn't a lot, considering that you have nearly 2 million Gazans who obviously need desperately humanitarian assistance. Nonetheless, this is progress, and I think this is an indication of where we are headed in terms of the shuttle diplomacy, both that Secretary Blinken has conducted and now the president himself personally on the ground in Israel.
Yes, and I think Israel set some quite tight conditions, didn't it? Suggesting it would only be food, water, medical supplies, only for civilians in the south or heading south. If Hamas were to get it, it would all be stopped. So they were quite categoric in deciding, what would come across. What about the cancellation of that Jordan summit? Was that a big miss, do you think, for this trip?
I think was a major misstep by the Jordanians, by the Egyptians, and by President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority. You have the President of the United States, who over the course of his presidency has been fairly disengaged when it comes to crises in Israel. We all remember 2021, and the president really took a hands-off approach. I was critical of it then. I think now where he's on the ground and you have these regional leaders who are not even going to engage in a conversation at a time when we face such high stakes was a major, major mistake. And obviously, the Egyptian president has recognized that he needs to do more. I think other leaders in the region need to do more. They need to be, quite frankly, more careful with their comments, with their assessments after events like we saw yesterday tragically transpire. Assigning blame without evidence. And we heard the Jordanian foreign minister earlier today saying, well, everyone believes. Quite frankly, that is not enough in this moment. You need to have facts. You need to have evidence before, as a government entity, you speak. And certainly you take the kinds of actions that pull out of an opportunity for peace.
Is it fair to say that the diplomacy we've seen from Antony Blinken, Joe Biden, Olaf Scholz as well, our own Foreign Secretary coming to the region too, has delayed the ground incursion? And what is your view of what might come?
There's no doubt, because as we saw Israeli troops building up on the Gazan border, they were ready to move in. Netanyahu clearly wanted to be shown to decisively take steps. And yet, I think the efforts both of British, American, other European leaders to hold them off worked. And I also believe that this is important in terms of keeping the international community on board, because if the Israelis had gone in or go in without at least making an effort to provide that needed assistance to Gazans, provide some of the opportunity for refugees to escape, as well as obviously in your conversations with the Israeli Defense Force earlier, they highlighted some of the steps that they're taking to reduce civilian casualties. All of this amounts to Israel being able to say, we have done everything reasonable in order to try and protect civilians. Now is the time for us to take action, as quite frankly, the UK, the US did after 9/11.
Brett, let's just listen to Joe Biden. We've got his comments now.
Quickly. And so I've been on the phone for the last, I don't know, we've been on the ground a while. That's why we haven't taken off with El Sisi. I don't think I was on that long. It was about probably half an hour. And both my team here was with me, and he agreed that what he would do is open the gate on to do two things. One, let up to 20 trucks through to begin with. Satterfield, my ambassador, is down there in Cairo now. He's going to coordinate this. He has my authority to do what is needed to get it done. They're going to patch the roads. They have to fill in potholes to get these trucks through, and that's going to occur. They expect it will take about 8 hours tomorrow. So there may be nothing rolling through until, what's today? I'm losing track of days. Thursday? Wednesday? Probably until Friday.
And that's the Rafah crossing you're talking
yes.
about? Yes.
Yes, and just hearing from John Kirby from the White House, they are hoping that more trucks will then follow. I mean, do you think a move like this will begin to calm the tensions we've seen, in Beirut today? We've just seen pictures in Amman, in Istanbul, in Turkey as well. The tensions across the Middle East, you can sense them at the moment.
Well, and I think regional leaders have a role to play there in calming those tensions, in pointing to this progress and saying, look, we are actively working, not just the Americans, not just obviously Israelis, but Egyptian leaders, other regional leaders are working on trying to stave off, at the very least, the worst potential humanitarian catastrophe. Let us give peace a chance. Let us give this process a chance. And if indeed those trucks roll in, if aid gets there, I think regional leaders will need to build upon that. They will need to show that they are offering evidence-based solutions, not simply criticizing and choosing every opportunity they can to attack Israel or vice versa, the Israelis of the Palestinians. But let us start to build confidence. Let us start to build trust. And then on that basis, I think we can potentially see some level of progress. I think, obviously, a peace agreement is a long way off at this stage.
Brett Bruen, President of the Global Situation Room and formerly Global Engagement Director at the White House. Good to have you on for that moment as well. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Great to be with you.
So let's just reiterate that breaking news. As you can see, Joe Biden was speaking there, suggesting that Egypt has agreed to allow 20 trucks to move through from the Rafah border crossing, which it controls, through to Gaza with aid. I suppose a word of warning, we have been here before. Certainly over the weekend, the suggestion was that it was going to be open for dual nationals to leave and aid to come in, and that did not happen. But Joe Biden certainly sounding confident that Egypt's president has agreed to open the Gaza border crossing to allow in 20 trucks with humanitarian aid. We're still to come on this Sky News special programme. One niece killed, another missing, and the mother among the dead. I sit down with an uncle whose relatives fell victim to Hamas.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. When you think of Glastonbury, it's mud you want and music. They're going to cross to us live in a minute. Okay. Thank you so much. Brad Pitt is now a prolific producer behind the scenes.
It's not a mystery to me. We always were capable of doing this.
Oh, they're wonderful children as an audience.
Who did that? Maverick here on the red carpet. I'm so excited, Tom Cruise. This is the story of the night.
It's the little independent film that could.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Nor have I ever struck any woman in my life.
There's this illusion of power.
Are you feeling well?
I remember covering the Oscars and that now infamous moment, the Will Smith slap. Nobody could quite believe that it had happened. You can tell from these crowds just how excited people are for the return of Pride.
These actors playing the lead roles were born long after the Sex Pistols broke up.
Are you pleased that you did say yes to the job?
I've never regretted it.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
Don't leave me.
Yeah, okay.
There's no easy goodies. There's no easy baddies.
I've had a great time here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.
The younger of 2 British sisters who were said to be missing after the Hamas attack on Israel has died. 13-year-old Yahel Sharabi and 16-year-old Noya disappeared from the Be'eri kibbutz after it was raided. I spoke to the uncle of the girls. A family in grief, a community of support for Raz Matalon, whose 13-year-old niece Yahel was confirmed dead today. Her 16-year-old sister Noya on the right, still missing.
He used to visit us for the weekends and sleep over. Noya and Yael were like friends to me. We didn't have the gap of the age. I looked at them as friends, and I believe they noticed it.
Their British mother Leanne had moved to Israel as a kibbutz volunteer at the age of 19. Her life taken too on that terrible day.
What we know about what happened in Leanne's house is not by eyewitness. No one saw what happened. But after the events, we managed to ask a friend who is a soldier in the army to go to the house and to see what happened over there. What we saw is gunshots on the shelter and also in the room in front of the shelter. And we saw 2 big blood stains on the floor. We need to go to the shelter. What you need to understand that the same happened in Be'eri, but outside the door there were terrorists, and the family stood here like this, and they just hold this as hard as they can, so they won't be able to open. And just that you understand now, we did this one, so we can be able to close the door, and so it won't be able to open the door. I don't know how to plan one funeral. I cannot think about doing 2, 3, or 4. So hopefully we will end with what we know now.
What he knows now is 2 dead, and Noya and her father Eli still missing, and his 22-year-old son called up to fight. Yes, and the girl's uncle is also missing. He was seen taken by Hamas in a car and is believed to be among the hostages. Well, that is all from this special programme from Jerusalem on the day that Joe Biden backed Israel in the row over who was responsible for the Gaza hospital.